Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, we are back. We are here. This is the first time we're recording after the NBA season has already started, and what an opening week it was. Obviously, shout out to all the teams and all the partners involved. So let's break it down. Let's kind of get started. We'll start off with opening night, just because it's been a while since we've spoken. And we had two opening night games, of course, Houston OKC, Lakers Golden State. So now you look at that first game, right? Obviously, Oklahoma City's the defending champs. It's ring night. They have the cool moment where they all touch the banner together as a team, right? All the battles and trials and tribulations that they all went through, and then the banner goes up into the rafters, and you get to play some basketball afterwards. And uh, this it was kind of a funny moment because you watch this game, and in the first quarter, right? You had Chet Holmgren, right, who we know at his best, right? He's a guy that can get it going, but he is a guy where because of his frame isn't always the strongest guy, but he was able to finish through contact, got a lot of shots going early. And SGA actually for most of the game was kind of swallowed up by Houston's defense, mainly by Amen Thompson. He was eventually able to get it going. They would set high screens to kind of get him into his spots, and then he started getting it going and he started cooking. Eventually, Thompson had to leave the game because of cramps, and then pretty much he was able to close it out. Now OKC was without Jalen Williams, right? And I remember when we did our opening night predictions, I did not know that he was going to be out for an extended period of time. But he is, I guess, still recovering from his wrist injury. But then we also got to see Houston. And, for Houston in its first game, right, even though they didn't win the game, you kind of saw some good things, right? Just because you got to see Amen Thompson, right, and Alperen Şengün kind of taking turns running some of the offense, right? Thompson couldn't hit a three, right, but he was able to get to his spots, driving to the basket, finishing through contact, of course, playing defense. We got to see the big giant lineup, right, where Steven Adams is the fifth starter next to these guys. Şengün hit 5 threes, right? Looked like the best player on the floor for most of the game. Jabari Smith Jr., of course, Kevin Durant, right, showing up as well. Also got to see some Reed Shepherd come off the bench. Look, had his moments, right, in terms of some shot making. Looked a little rough on the defensive end, but again, it's a work in progress. He's barely played, and this was kind of the first big game that he was a part of, right? Because he didn't really play much for Houston last year. Still without Dorian Finney-Smith. Don't know when he'll come back. So there were some good positives in terms of the identity, the size, and physicality. Obviously, late in the game, actually, they had the lead for most of the game. They were in control for most of it. And then eventually, right, the offense kind of sputtered down the stretch. OKC was able to get it going with SGA. And that's kind of one of the concerns that you have for this Houston team late in games. I do think, not making excuses necessarily, but I do think Dorian Finney-Smith, if he comes back at some point, right, that's a guy that can help space the floor from three, just because that way you don't have as many stretches where you just don't have a lot of shooters out there. But the thing that makes you feel good is you see Thompson and Şengün making that leap, right? Where those guys look like, really strong players on the floor, right? Just in terms of, like I said, on the court with guys like Kevin Durant and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, like some of those guys, were right there. Like I said, Alperen Şengün looked like the best player on the floor for a while. So better days are ahead for this team. I still think they need to go out and get a point guard. But, for Oklahoma City, obviously they kind of, were able to close it out in double OT, right? I know it went into the first overtime, right, with the Durant timeout thing. But it was a great game to start off opening night. Just a battle of, two teams that think are going to be really good. We already know OKC is going to be good. And you don't really win by losing if you're Houston. But just I felt like from what I saw, if those young guys are as good as we felt like they were going to be, that's one of the reasons why we took the over. We took the over before the Van Vliet injury, but we still think they can win a lot of games because those guys are really good. They're only going to get better. And they're going to have to go through these reps, right? Because, they're going to have to win at some point these type of close games where, you kind of have to find some ways to get some good offense going. And, that's one of the reasons why you got Durant, but they still struggle to create some easy shots. And then some of the open threes, like Thompson, he's getting wide open threes. They're not guarding him. Those are going to have to go in at some point. But like I said, even despite the loss, think there were a lot of positives to take for Houston. And then, like I said, for Oklahoma City, got the win. SGA was great. And now they're banged up, seemingly, right? Because, AJ Mitchell, he's come in, for some of these guys being out, and now he's a viable rotational guy. He played for them last year, but couldn't play a lot because he got hurt.
Mhm.
But now he's out there taking some of the minutes from some of these guys while they're out. Looks great, by the way. And then also SGA, of course, even in the next game at 55. So, just great play from him through the first couple of games, even though the first 3 quarters of the first game, he didn't really look that great.
Yeah, I think this game was amazing to watch, and I think the first quarter was kind of telltale of what Houston's season can potentially look like. I think if things kind of if they don't make any changes, right? Because like you said, they struggled early on, I think offensively to kind of like get the easy looks, like, late in the shot clock, it just seemed like they were just going to Durant, which is obviously the reason why you go out and get, a player of his caliber and whatnot. But I think they missed a lot of opportunities to really generate and get, a feel for the offense and find that groove, because that's what's, I think, gonna, probably hinder this team is, being able to get in rhythm early. I think they need to find a way to do that. Granted, though, we already know they play a very, I guess old school brand of basketball, right? A lot of shots in the paint, a lot of, mid ranges, a lot of stuff like that, which is cool because, a lot of those guys can create, you have Şengün, who has a float game. He has a good, sense for offensive rebounding, as well as like, Steven Adams, and you have Amen also, crashing the boards as well. But yeah, there were times where I definitely did not like the stagnation of the offense, and even defensively, there were times when they did look really, really good, but then you kind of plug and play Reed Shepherd, and he's obviously the weak link defensively, and he was attacked viciously pretty much throughout the entire game, which I think people expected. But
Yeah.
there's going to be positives and negatives with him, but I think he needs to learn how to read the floor.
Mhm.
No pun intended, but yeah, he needs to learn how to make the right
Oh,
reads. Yeah, we need to. He'll I think gain a lot of experience, and that's kind of what this is going to be for. But yeah, honestly, in my opinion, I thought, I'm going to be real, and I have to hold the guy accountable. I think KD's performance was a little underwhelming, if you want me to be honest.
Okay.
I thought he could have done better. Granted, it is kind of tough when, like, you don't have an initiator on the offensive end, right? Especially one that can't shoot, right? Like, it's not good. It's not a good sign when I think, KD and Amen Thompson go 0 for 11 from the 3-point line. That's not that's you're pretty much not going to win the game, right? Like, Şengün was kind of carrying that team, in terms of, the 3-point volume, which is probably not ideal, because I remember when before the season started, I was like, he's not really like a stretch big, so it's kind of hard for them to play 5 out. Granted, he might have added that to his game, might have improved a little bit, but it is a little worrisome, just considering that this was a winnable game for them, and I think if they just generated the right looks and got into rhythm early, this could have been avoided. But shout out to OKC, man. What a statement win from them as well, right? Because a lot of people, including myself, have Houston winning this title, so they're kind of one of the challengers that OKC needs to stifle, and they did that. Kind of, I don't want to say bare bones, but they did it without some of their guys, right? Like, you did it without your second best player. Shout out to Chet. It seems like he's added a lot into his bag. I think he's a little bit more fluid. He's moving better with the ball in his hands. I think we all knew that what he was capable of when you saw him at Gonzaga, when you saw him, in high school. But this is a different level, and now he's putting the ball on the floor, like you said. He's finishing, at the rack, and also extending the 3-point range. Because I know he's a good shooter, but it is interesting to kind of see him shooting a little further back and actually draining threes. Defensively good, and I don't even really, take the fouling out into account, considering double overtime, right? So extended minutes of play. Same thing with KD as well. But
like 3-4 guys foul out of this
exactly.
game.
So I don't like that. Doesn't really like speak to me as like bad defense. That's just extended periods of time and play. But yeah, Oklahoma City, man, shout out to them, because we all know, as good as they are offensively, they're still just as good defensively. They did not make it easy for a lot of these guys, right? Like Şengün, he had a monster performance, but that was a lot of work. Like that was a wild game. So yeah, shout out to them for giving us a great start to the season.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing with Şengün, where the 5 of 8 from 3. It wasn't like he just was getting random threes, where it's like, oh, I'm just being completely unguarded at the end of the clock. I have no choice but to shoot. He's like stepping into rhythm,
Yeah,
in his
grenades
games. And
too.
yeah, and he shot 10 for 11 from the free throw line.
Mhm.
So, that's hopefully a good sign that the jump shot's kind of working and going in progress, is working well. Because if that's the case, like you said, that's going to help them on the offensive end because they need some guys to be able to. I mean, nobody could hit a three in this game. I mean,
Yeah,
OKC
yeah, yeah.
shot 25% from three. Houston shot 28% from three. So they actually shot better, although they made a couple less. Really, it was the free throws, the rebounding, and everything else. But yeah, so like you said, shout out to Oklahoma City and shout out to AJ Mitchell, as I mentioned, because that's a guy where as I'm with some of these guys out, he's kind of just come in and has been able to provide them some level of offense where, he can hit the three, but he can also get downhill, and also help some of their driving kicks as well. Because we know OKC, like you said, they're really, they're good on both ends of the floor, but their strength is definitely their defense, and their offense, at times has been kind of weird. And on a night and for a stretch where J Dub is going to be out, that's another guy that's athletic that can get downhill in terms of J Dub. But now you have a guy in AJ Mitchell who can do that to a certain degree, and that's going to help spread their offensive attack out a little bit more. So it's it's a good sign when a guy like that right now is going to be seemingly part of the rotation. I mean, even in the second game they played against the Pacers, right? Like they put, they had even more guys out, right? Because they didn't have Cason Wallace, and a couple other guys as well. And all of a sudden, it's like Usman Jang, Chris Youngblood got a few minutes out there. We've seen Brooks Barnheiser play as well, right? Topic, if he was healthy, I think he would probably be playing.
Mhm.
So just having all these guys, all this depth is really helpful for a team to have because there's no guarantees that they're going to be super healthy, right?
Yeah.
Because like last year, they did have some injuries, but it was mostly their front court guys like Chet and Hartenstein missed a lot of time, but most of the other guys, I guess, other than Caruso missed a decent amount of time. But other than that, most of the other guys were relatively healthy. So if they can still continue to rack up wins while they're while guys are out, that's a great sign, because those guys were guys that didn't play as much last year. So now they get to play minutes and they get experience. Because you just never know when you might have to insert one of those guys into a key game. So I mean, did you feel better about Houston? Like so coming out of that game, or did you
Well,
kind of feel a little bit worse?
I mean, they kind of showed me and proved
Yeah.
my point as to why I think they can take OKC in 7.
Okay.
Granted, no J
Hmm.
Dub, and that's a huge thing because I think if J
Right.
Dub plays and he plays at the level that we expect him to, it might have been a
Mhm.
little bit of a different game. But um, I still think Houston would have been able to scheme and game plan for him. I think there probably would have been more mismatches
Right.
available for
Yeah.
Oklahoma City to exploit if J Dub was there, right? Because we already know how versatile he is. He's pretty much a walking mismatch on both ends of the
Mhm.
floor. But regardless, I think there were more positives for Houston than negatives. So I do
Yeah.
feel good about them, even though they are 0-2.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's how I actually did feel better about Houston coming out of that game than I would have, going in. But like you said, just the late game execution
Horrible.
is a problem. But that's why, maybe they can fix that at the deadline and go out and get some type of point guard, and also just getting reps and playing together. Cause again, I mean, this is a different team than last year's team, right? Because like there's no Jalen Green, there's no Dylan Brooks. It's Kevin Durant instead, who's obviously much better, right?
Yeah.
But it's still going to take a little bit of time to get used to and adjust, So
Yeah,
that's
it was
yeah,
kind of mind-boggling to watch. I'm not gonna lie, and I don't want to harp on it too much, but the
right.
Reed Shepard thing was kind of, I don't want to say infuriating, but annoying to watch because you could tell that he's trying, but like when he had the ball in his hands at times, especially when he got trapped, it was pretty much over, right? Because
Yeah,
KD's telling him to swing one way, and then he just forces it to KD. It's a turnover, right? So it's
yeah,
like things like that need to be sharpened if you want to actually be in the rotation.
yeah. You like the confidence in terms of being willing to take shots because you need guys
Yep.
like that. It's just you got to be able to, like you said, read the floor
Yeah.
a little bit better. But that's gonna help. That's gonna come hopefully with more reps and whatnot.
Exactly.
Because yeah, but yeah, we'll see how that goes. And yeah, like you mentioned, they also did play Detroit later on, right? And they, and Detroit was able to win that game and close it out kind of in similar-ish fashion. But also you had I guess I'll mention it before we get into the next game. Shout out NBC, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I hadn't even mentioned opening night began with NBC with Peacock, right? Where different broadcasting team, different group of people, right? We've seen them all before in different areas, but it is a different team, right? Like in the studio, right? It was like Maria Taylor, it was Tracy McGrady, it was Vince Carter, Mello as well, right? They all had, in my opinion, really good chemistry, right? Talking and kind of analyzing and breaking down everything in the studio before halftime and after the game. Then, right, you have the commentators, right? It was Mike Tirico,
Yep.
Reggie Miller,
Yep.
right? Was there a third person?
Jamal Crawford.
Jamal Crawford,
Yes,
yeah,
sir.
yeah. That's what I was trying to remember if he was in the first or the second game, but yeah. So they all did a great job, and we'll get into Amazon a little bit later. But yeah, like day one of a new product, right? They kind of tease everybody, right? Where they have the round ball rock thing. They have the NBC intro where it's like 4x3 with the black
Yep.
bars, and it zooms out and it's HD 4K, whatever you're watching it on. And it's really cool. It's really awesome to see, and very different just compared to what we had been used to, with the other products. Just because a lot more of the focus was on the more positive aspects of the teams and of the league. And it's not that you can't criticize the product at all. It's just you'd like to have a little bit more balance. Just because, people are watching the game. So you would like to hear some good things about what you're watching from time to time. So I thought all of them did a fantastic job with that game. And then obviously we move into the second game of opening night, right? And that was Lakers Warriors, right? That was a different game. That wasn't quite as, back and forth as the other one, right? And this one, it's kind of a game where the Warriors were kind of able to showcase, why there are people who are very high on that team, right? Because you watch them play. Obviously, you have the Steph factor, you have Jimmy Butler, right? But Steph didn't play quite as well in that game, but Butler, 31 points, a bunch of free throw attempts. Of course, Al Horford made his debut, right? He was coming off the bench. They actually started Jonathan Kuminga, which I think was the surprising part. I don't think any of us would have assumed that. And the cool thing with him is, in watching him play through the first few games, is the stats don't necessarily jump off the page, but in some cases that's actually a good thing, because when you watch him play, he's really not trying to do too much. He's not trying to overcompensate for anything. He's just fitting in. He's playing his role. Like, he's moving the ball around. I think so far through 3 games, he's averaged 4 assists, 7 rebounds. So that's a really well-rounded, balanced stat line. And you watch him play, he's getting shots within the offense, not creating a whole lot on his own. And that's awesome, because that type of leap, if he's actually going to do that for as long as he's here, that's going to help make the Warriors better. That's going to help increase their floor and their ceiling, potentially, as a team, because they need some young guys to be able to give them a little bit more juice, right? Because it's some of the other young guys have been a little bit more underwhelming so far to begin the season. Will Richard, right, comes out as a rookie, didn't even know that he was going to play. He plays, he makes an impact on both ends of the floor. So that's pretty cool to see. And just through the first few games, and I guess we can kind of just tie it in together, right? Like, Steph, he's played very well through the first 3 games of the season, and that's kind of one of the benefits of the Butler trade. And Horford kind of showcased his versatility and his value, why so many people thought that was a good signing. And that's why in my mind I'm like, everybody was, including ourselves, were making fun of the fact that they took so long for their signings to be official. Of course, it's an older team, but it's like, if you step back, you look at the roster, it's a good team. Right? Like, this is a good team that's capable of winning a lot of games. It's just, the question is, how far can they go in the postseason, right? Because you have to go through the 82 game grind of the regular season and the postseason, right? Because, like, in the third game, it's the second night of a back-to-back. They got the win against Denver in overtime, and then they just get completely annihilated by Portland in their first game, post some stuff that happened that we'll get into a little bit later. But we'll start with Golden State. What did you think of Golden State in terms of what you saw in the game, right? Because
Yeah.
they've played the most out of any team so far.
Yeah. I mean, Steph. I know in this game, like you said, nothing, too spectacular, but still solid, right? Enough to pretty much seal the deal. But I think a big story, like you said, is going to be, Kuminga, right? Because I think if he is on pace to have an Andrew Wiggins type of season from when they won the title, this team
Mhm.
actually might have a chance at, you know, a title, like legitimately. That just because of how by committee they are, and you also do have the star power as well. Like that's kind of underrated, I feel like, in this aspect, right? Because you do have Jimmy and Steph, which is a lethal combo because they work so perfectly together. They take pressure off of each other, and it's amazing. But yeah, even like the bench is strong, right? Like you have kind of a guy that can play every role that you would want, right? Like you have a Buddy Hield, you have a Al Horford, you have Gary Payton, and even like a guy like potentially like Will Richard, like a rookie. So, and then you add in Pajemski and Kuminga into the mix. So I think they might be poised to actually have a really good season. I think it's just going to be contingent on it's not necessarily a sprint; it's more of a marathon, right? What does this team look like by the end of the season? And
Evan Ham.
yeah, yeah, great quote, right? But yeah, we'll see what happens. But I've been thoroughly impressed with them throughout the opening week.
Yeah, and again, that's kind of the nice thing about this team is, like you said, the Kaminga thing we didn't know, right? We didn't really know what necessarily to expect, right? Because you look at this team and you're like, well, they've had a great infrastructure. They've not had a whole lot of just blow ups with guys. I mean, I guess they've had like a few, but just by and large, they've been very consistent in terms of not a lot of chaos or drama. I guess in the you have the Draymond stuff, but just as a whole, like this is an organization or a team in terms of the culture, right? With Steph, with Draymond, with Steve Kerr, right? That you can trust in terms of they put the pressure on, or the front office put the pressure on Kaminga and his representation, right? Because they're like, we're calling your bluff. We don't think you're going to take the qualifying offer. You're going to take one of these offers that we're going to give you. You'll still get paid. And we'll take it from there. And if he plays that well, maybe they don't trade him at all. We don't know because I don't know what type of offers will be out there, but that's going to be a key thing to watch for them this season, just because in all the games that they've played so far, he's been a big part of it. Like in the Laker game, he had a huge third quarter where he was knocking down shots. He was getting to the basket. In the Denver game, he had a few moments, especially in the fourth quarter, right, where we kind of got to see, him getting to the basket, moving the ball around. Like I said, he's averaging 4 assists a game. That's really impressive for a guy who's not particularly known, as a strong passer. I mean, people talked about him kind of being a ball stopper in some ways. So just awesome to see. And, this is kind of the argument for why this guy is considered to be a talented player. It's just he wasn't playing the style of basketball that they need him to play if he's going to be good and if he's going to stick around. And so far, how he is. So that's great. And then I even mentioned, like I said, the Horford piece, right, where people were kind of like, well, this guy's old. How much is he going to actually be able to give him? He'd still give him something in these games,
Yeah.
right? Because so I mean, and that's like I said, that was kind of my argument for why I was higher on this team in terms of what they could potentially do, and that was even without factoring in the Kuminga piece. So far they've been very impressive through the first 3 games. On the other side, right, because there were 2 teams who did play. You did have the Lakers, right, and they didn't look quite as strong in this game. They did play 2 games. They played against Minnesota afterwards, looked a lot better in that one. And the key thing here, right, was you had that starting group that started together in their final preseason game, right, where it's Gabe Vincent is the 5th starter, right, without LeBron, right? It's Luka, Austin, Rui, Ayton, and Gabe Vincent, right? And you could kind of see, okay, well, I guess defensively he did a decent job chasing Steph around on the perimeter, and he didn't necessarily go off and completely annihilate their team. But on the other hand, there were a lot of possessions where he's guarding Jimmy Butler, and there's just not a whole lot he can do against Jimmy Butler. There's a pretty big size difference. And it just didn't really go well for him, right? Like again, Jimmy Butler had 31 points, he had 16 free throw attempts, made all of them. So not necessarily great there. Luka was great, right? So he had 43 points, 12 rebounds, 9 assists, 2 steals, and a block as well, right? I mean, he could have had 50 points if he had knocked down a few more of his threes. Austin Reeves at 26 and 9 and 5. That stat line is a little bit fraudulent because a lot of that kind of came towards the end of the game when it was out of reach. But most of the other players had relatively disappointing outings. Marcus Smart was in there. He actually was the only guy that had a positive plus minus. Did some good things. Also had 4 fouls in the first half. It was kind of a flop off between him and Jimmy and Steph. So that was kind of, silly, I guess, from that perspective, but they just didn't look very good in this game compared to Golden State. They looked like a team that had not had a lot of reps together, where it's just kind of a lot of chaos all over the place. Guys don't know where to be, where to go, what to do, really on either end of the floor. Because even offensively, I mean, they didn't look good. They had 19 turnovers. They missed 11 free throws. They shot 25% from three on 32 attempts. So really, just kind of a bad performance, just overall, right? Really outside of Luka, and a much better performance in the second game against Minnesota, right? That was the team that beat the brakes off of them in the postseason last year, right? And just kind of an interesting first two games where the constant has been Luka. He's been unbelievable through the first couple of games. He's been much more able to get to the basket, and finish through contact and be comfortable driving a lot because he's getting a ton of free throw attempts. He's finishing in the paint. I think I saw a stat line where through the first two games, he's shooting like 90% on twos, right? So just twos, as in like, inside the 3-point line. So, if you're going to get that version of Luka, then you're going to be able to win more games. But one of the issues is the surrounding parts are not necessarily an ideal grouping if you're trying to build a team around Luka, especially with LeBron out.
Yeah.
Right. But, if you can get something closer to maybe what you saw in the second game, where we talked about it, it's going to have to be win by committee, right? It can't just be Luka dropping 40, 50 every game and then they still lose. You're going to have to get some good production from a number of these other players as well, which, it was just kind of stark to see the difference between the Warriors game and the Wolves game. And they made adjustments, right? Because even in the Wolves game, they started that same starting five, and early on in the game, it didn't look great, right? They were giving up offensive boards. They were giving away shots at the rim. Then they adjusted. Even with Ayton, he didn't look great in the first half of the Wolves game. Wasn't spectacular against the Warriors either. Then in the second half, they switched it up, right? They put him more in the short roll. They stopped, just throwing him lobs whenever, because that's not quite his game. They kind of became more comfortable giving him the ball in the spots where he needs to be, and he's been solid on the defensive end. But that's kind of one of the things about not taking preseason quite as seriously. Not that it's the end all be all, but just they prioritize seemingly health over getting the reps in, getting the chemistry down. And that's why, like I said, in that first game, they looked like a team that had barely played together compared to the Warriors, where, yeah, there are some new faces, but a lot of the guys are the same guys from last year, which in fairness, that's, the Lakers as well. But there are some new pieces for them to work in. But, Luka looks fantastic. It's just, and Reeves looked more comfortable in the second game. It's a matter of, can this work while LeBron is out? How many games are they going to be able to win? Can they stay afloat? Where in the first game, you're like, I don't know if they can stay afloat while LeBron's out. Like, I don't know. Like, they might just be play-in bound, basically, unless LeBron comes back quicker than expected. But, like I said, a second game, stark difference. And could just be matchups. But, yeah, just like I said, I didn't want to talk. I know I talked about the second game, but just it's kind of hard to, talk about, them and then like talk about them later on with the second game. Might as well rope them in together. So I thought that there were a lot of good signs from the Warriors, not quite as much from the Lakers, at least in the first game. But that's why it's kind of hard to overreact to game one, because we talked about it with Houston. Like, there will be a stretch where they will look much better as the season goes on, as they become more comfortable playing together.
Yeah, the Lakers didn't didn't look prepared, I think, enough, obviously. And I think it is kind of tough because you are integrating, some other guys. Like, I'm not gonna lie, in the first game I wasn't really impressed with what I saw from DeAndre Ayton. I'm gonna be real. I think there were a lot of missed opportunities with him, but overall it's going to be tough because you are playing without your second best player, and I don't know if they have enough to kind of pick up the slack. But like you said, in the second game they look much better, right? You got guys like Rui, getting more comfortable, Aiton as well, and then Luka's already been on a tear, and we already know how good of a compliment AR is to Luka. So I'm not. I'm kind of worried, but at the same time, not really. I think it's just really going to depend on who they play up against, right? Like, depending on the night, it'll probably be easy, but there are some tricky ones, I think, kind of just sprinkled in there. But against the Warriors, it's kind of a hard matchup because you have to deal with Jimmy, Steph, and then if you have a good Kuminga game, that's pretty much a nail in the coffin, as well as the bench.
Yeah, a lot of people have kind of mentioned, and I agree. Like Golden State is one of the strangest team in the league to play, especially like on a night to night basis where you're not. It's not like it's the playoffs where you can game plan,
Yeah.
for a specific team. It's like you just kind of go in and you can scout and talk about it, but it's not the same level of preparation. It's a weird team to play, especially now that they're much better than they had been the last couple of seasons. So that just it's a tough matchup to play through the first few games of the season because like Steph can't guard him the same way you can guard any other player in the league. The way they play is unique to basically themselves. No other team in the league really plays like how they do. Like you said, now you add the other star power with Jimmy Butler and the other role players. So it's a tough team, to play. And just as a whole, they're known for kind of making a lot of bigs look really suspect, right? Just because they can swarm, they can make guys second guess what they're going to do around the basket, right? And for even a guy like Aiton, right, where like you can see at times he can make the right read. It is a little bit slow, and so against a team like Golden State that's got quick hands and they're always super active, that's a tough matchup to kind of figure out. But like I said, that's why in the second game, Minnesota's a completely different team, right? But the Lakers looked very uncomfortable against Minnesota last year. And this is the regular season. It's one game, so you can't overreact, but looked much better. And part of that was Luka, right? Because he didn't have a great series against the Wolves in the postseason, right? He couldn't really get to the basket, couldn't really take advantage of the defenders that they put on him. And, here he made Jaden McDaniels look silly. He couldn't really do anything
Yeah.
against him. Nobody really could, right? They put Ant on him. Of course, the bigs at different points were switched on him, and it was very difficult for them to be able to guard him. And, when he's in that mode and if he's going to play at that level, he's got a real chance to possibly be an MVP guy
Yeah.
this year. They're going to have to win, right? So that's going to be the tough part. But if he's healthy and he looks like, as we've talked about, he's in great shape, you don't see him getting quite as fatigued, from first half to second half. It's real, right? And it's legit. And this is kind of one of the things that I think was going to be pretty expected, right? We all kind of assumed that he was going to be able to do it. It's just a matter of continuing to stay healthy. And what does that look like as the grind of the season goes on and on and on? Because they're in game two. They still have 80 more to go.
Yeah, exactly. I'm
Yeah.
curious.
So then moving on to night two, right? Obviously that was ESPN night. We did talk about the Warriors, we did talk about the Warriors in that one, but we'll start off with Wemby having a statement game against the Dallas Mavericks, right? The giant front court. Gafford wasn't there, right? But you still had AD, still had Derek Lively, still had all those other wings. And it's funny, right? Because going into the game, really, to be honest, the big story was Cooper Flag, right? Making his NBA debut, right? Like obviously people mention Wemby because, how could you not, right? But the main story going into it was Cooper Flag's debut. And that really ended up not really being as much of a factor. I mean, of course, you saw Flag in his first game. It started off rough, but it did get a lot better, right? He had some stretches where he was getting to the basket. He had a double-double, right? He ended up having, 10 points, 10 rebounds. Had a stretch, right, where he kind of showcased, why people are really high on him. But, if you've watched the Mavs through the first couple of games, it's rough, right? Just because he's running the point guard. They really haven't played much of their other guards at all. And it's been ugly, right, on both ends of the floor, right? Because, offensively, that was kind of one of my concerns, right, in terms of like how are they going to score while Kyrie is out consistently. But even defensively, it's been bad. I mean, they lost to the Wizards the other night, right? That's supposed to be one of the worst teams in the league.
Yes.
And the Wizards were up pretty much the entire wire to wire, right?
Yeah.
And and there's a game where you look you look at AD's stat line in the second game, it's like that's seemingly like a good stat line, but they just can't get stops or score. And that's a bad combination, especially when your offense is that bad. It's hard to be that bad. And then, when you're that bad offensively, it bleeds into your defense. They look kind of slow, especially with that giant lineup. And their guards can't stay in front of anybody. It's just it's rough. But obviously the highlight of the Spurs Mavs game was Wemby, which I should have actually started with, funny enough. But he had 40 points, 15 rebounds, 3 blocks. Almost every play in the game that he made, could be one of the best plays of almost any player's career. That's how ridiculous it was, right? Like tighter handle for a 7-4 guy, like crossing guys up, stepping back into the three, being able to finish around the basket, off the glass, getting to the free throw line as well, right? Like that's kind of a cool development for him where all of a sudden he's getting, 7, 8, 9 trips to the free throw line. That's super impressive. Already talked about the jump shot. And then, of course, the defensive end, where he's able to just be a game changer of force. And this was a team that we did have the under on. If he keeps playing like that, right, that one's going to be wrong for sure. But even on top of that, right, this was a game where De'Aaron Fox was out. Stephon Castle steps into his place. He looked great, right? Stephon Castle, he was able to get to his spots in transition, even knock down a few jumpers, was a terror defensively, terror on the glass, 7 rebounds, 6 assists. Just great basketball from him. And then also we got to see Dylan Harper, right, who came off the bench. He showed some great play as well, right? With the ball in his hands, a little bit more opportunity without De'Aaron Fox. That's going to be kind of a interesting development to see. But just the fact that he's so comfortable off the dribble, getting to his spots, even with the jumper, right? Like it's a work in progress, but he's so athletic that it's easy to see why everybody, including ourselves, right? We're like really high on him. Like you think he might be, one of the best players in the league
Yes,
down the
I do.
line. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's a great development from him. And, with the Spurs, with the combination of, obviously Wemby, all these young guys, some of the vets that they've added, right? Like you got Luke Cornett coming in, and now you can have multiple lineups where like Wemby's off the floor and you can still have a giant rim protecting big. You can have both of them out at the same time, right? Like Olynyk hasn't played yet. So just so many positives, from this team. And like I said, it all starts with Wemby, where just against a big physical front court, athletic front court. I mean, he was by far the best player on the floor, and on a court that has Anthony Davis, right? Where the last time they played each other consistently in the regular season, AD outplayed him honestly, right? And so now it's a different team, and for the Spurs, sky's the limit. Like I said, I'm curious to see what it looks like this year, just because Fox hasn't even played yet, but through the first 2 games, just Wemby has been just every bit of how he was hyped up as, like, and we knew, like, the question was how good was he going to be, was he actually going to be a top 5 player, because if he is, he could be an MVP guy, the Spurs are going to be better. He's knocking on that door, he may already be there at
Yeah,
this point,
I
and
think
he's
he
only
is.
going to get better from here, right? I mean, we're in year 3 of his career, still super young, and like I said, just even from a skill standpoint, like I mentioned, the ball handling, the tight handle, like the just from a guy who's 7'4". We've seen him in person. And when you watch him in person, like it almost doesn't even feel like it's real. Like
Yeah.
it's like one of those 2K guys you create in a video game where you just max out the height, give him like 99 everything, and there you go. That's Wemby. He has no comparisons. Like
Yeah.
you can't compare him to anybody. He's a special player and is going to be, I think an all-timer
Yeah, it's
for
funny.
sure.
It's funny because Dylan Harper, he posted on Instagram on his story. He was like, and it was in reference to Wemby's performance. He was like, and y'all said 7-4s on 2K aren't realistic. But this guy, I'm telling you, this guy is crazy. But I think
Yeah.
my favorite part of this, was the lack of volume of 3-point shots. This guy has
Right.
learned to not settle, and that's the scariest thing, right? He's going to use his frame, he's going to use his body. He's crashing the boards. It's just going to be a nightmare, I think, night in, night out for every single team that has to go up against San Antonio. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the other guys, right? Like, I think there is going to be pressure on, Dylan Harper, Devin Vassell, Stephon Castle, because, is their shooting going to be,
Right.
like how they shot in these games? Who knows, right? It could be a lot worse. And then especially if you do bring in De'Aaron Fox, who's definitely not, a sharpshooter by any means, but there's so many positives to take away from the Spurs in both of their first 2 games. But yeah, Wemby's insane. This guy is ridiculous. Like I said, right? Like, he's not settling anymore, and I think that's the scariest version of him. And yeah, everything looks polished, everything looks more refined. And I guess that time off and the off-season work has really just shown already, and I'm really scared for what type of season he's gonna have. Um, yeah, Dallas though, I don't know how I feel about that team. Like, granted, like you were talking about with the defense and, especially a lack of a defensive kind of minded point guard, you see why they did kind of start Cooper Flag at the one, right? In terms of that, because of what he can do defensively and stuff. But yeah, they really just need Kyrie, I think, because, he's going to bring, a lot of creation aspects to the game that they don't really have, especially, outside of, their big men. And yeah, you're right. Like they just got outplayed and pretty much erased, I think, in the first game.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because it's gotten to the point where there's a lot of possessions where it's like Klay Thompson is kind of forced to dribble, and he's kind of taking these one-legged fadeaway shots. It just looks bad, and
Yeah.
like maybe I know he's not the same player at this point, but I just think with more ball handling and a little bit more skill in that lineup, like it could help. It's just when is he coming back? Because the problem is if he doesn't come back anytime soon, they might already just be flat out cooked because this Western Conference is going to be brutal, right? And with all these games, I think it was Grant Hill. He was on the Lakers Warriors broadcast and he mentioned because we've talked about it, like by the time you get to the end of the season and all these teams are a game or two apart, these matchups and these tiebreakers are gonna matter, right? Because like there could be a scenario where the Spurs and the Mavs are fighting for positioning, and say they, whatever their regular season tiebreaker scenario is, it's like, wow, you got destroyed by 30 on your opening night against the Spurs, and like that one game could be one of the reasons why you end up finishing below them, or that could be the difference between being like 6 versus being like 7, 8, 9, 10, something like that. And so I don't know when he's coming back, but this team looks like I said, I was lower on this team, I think, than some people, but just as a whole through the first two games, it has been very nasty. And I think it can be better. But one of the reasons why, and we both took the under, so I don't want to make it seem like it's just me.
Yeah, yeah.
But one of the reasons why we're like, there's going to be growing pains with this team, even like a Cooper Flag. Like, there's no, I mean, he's 18 years old, so there's no guarantee that he's going to just right out of the gates, put up great stat lines. And I'm not trying to make it seem like he's been horrible through the first two games. It's just, it's not an ideal scenario to be in where it's like, yeah, as he continues to mature and progress, like this is kind of nice that he's going to get all the reps early, right? And so we could easily a week from now kind of go back and just kind of laugh and be like, hey, remember how, he had these, rough moments through the first few games and now he looks much more comfortable. But it's a process. I mean, because like, we've talked about it in the last few years with this podcast, like, running point guard at the NBA level. I mean, at any level, honestly, but of course, especially in the NBA, is certainly not an easy thing to do. Not speaking from experience, but just as a whole, like we know it's because all the things that you have to do in terms of like reading the floor, communicating with teammates, and kind of figuring out where guys are going to be, where they're supposed to go. It's not easy, right? And on top of that, like this is a roster where like you desperately need some type of shot creator, a la maybe the guy they traded. But just either way, I'm curious to see if it gets better because just not great, right? I'm of course like the Wizards are not going to go 0-82, but just that's a team that like on paper, if you're the Mavs, like you should probably beat, right? Where it ends up being Keyshawn George, right, who's the best player on the floor, basically. Which maybe he's poised for a year two leap.
I hope.
But yeah, but just not great from the Mavs. It's one of the teams where so far through the first couple of games, it's been bad. Like no real positives, honestly. I mean, like even AD, like in the his numbers have been good, but it feels just like something defensively just kind of off, right? Where and that's part of kind of the concerns of having him at the four, where like just in general, they just look kind of slow.
I agree.
And then even off, you said what?
I said I agree.
Yeah, just looks kind of slow. I know I guess he came into camp a little bit bigger. And I've seen that before from him as a Laker fan where, he'll look different as the season goes on. But and I'm not just, I'm not trying to put a bunch of blame on him, but just as a whole, if we saw at the Mavs games, right? They already are doing the fire Nico thing already after getting Cooper Flag in the draft. So just, like I said, I don't know where this goes, but this is why it's great to have basketball back. It's just we do have to be careful because we could say that, and then a few weeks from now it looks a lot better. But they're gonna have to probably make some adjustments. I think for it to improve. I don't think they can keep doing this and then it gets better because it's just you don't have a lot of you need some type of guard somewhere, right? Because I think we kind of just assumed that when they first signed him that D'Lo would start until Kyrie comes back, and like you said, it's not necessarily the identity that they're trying to put together, but just I mean, he can at least to some degree, right, kind of help you out on the offensive end. But he's basically been playing a major bench role. I think
Mm-hmm.
Ryan Nembhard got more minutes
Yep.
than he did, right, in the last game against the in that Spurs game. Like he's kind of just been the guy that they've been going to. So not great, I
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah, I agree.
Um,
It's borderline danger zone already.
Yeah. Also, got to see because that was the nightcap game, but on that same night, we did get to see the New York Knicks play the Cleveland Cavaliers. We've seen the Knicks through a couple of games. They played the Cavs a little bit shorthanded, no Garland, no Max Strus. And then they also played the Boston Celtics as well, right? The Tatumless Boston Celtics. And through the first couple of games, you can kind of see with them, right? Like they've had some guys out, so they've kind of had to shift some things around. Mitchell Robinson hasn't played. In the first game, neither Hart nor Mitchell Robinson played. But, Mike Brown, he's using the depth. The guys are moving the ball around. It's a lot more balanced offensive attack, right? Where, in one of the games, like OG Anunoby is like the leading scorer, right? And like this, and that's not to say that he's going to be the leading scorer over the course of the season, but just in terms of spreading out the offense, giving guys more things to do, like Mikal Bridges on the offensive end. He's gotten some good possessions there, and that's kind of what you want to see with the Knicks because we talked about it where it's like if it's primarily just Brunson ball, and of course that's been very effective, but there is kind of a ceiling, right, to that type of basketball where it's like it's just very hard, right, where your offense is centered around one guy. We've talked about the heliocentric style offense. You need other options. You need different options. And being able to do that in the regular season environment, still being able to win. So by the time you get to the playoffs, everybody's comfortable doing it. I mean, there will be times where they'll default back to it because that's just what happens, especially late in games. But it's a good sign. Just especially again, they have depth. So they can put up these other guys out here. I mean, he played everybody through the first couple of games, right? Like we even saw guys like Tyler Kolek, Ariel Huckporty, right? We saw basically guys almost all the way down to the end of the bench play, right? Which is the opposite of what we saw last year from Tibbs. So far, good job for the Knicks on both ends of the floor, right? There's a lot to like in terms of what we've seen, and this is kind of one of the reasons why like we're all really high on this Knicks team in the Eastern Conference, right? Because they have the talent. You got the wings to be able to be versatile on the defensive end. You have bigs, right? They've leaned into this double big lineup, right? Because once Robinson comes back, they'll probably be starting like we expect, and they'll kind of get that going. So they have a lot of options and a lot of good signs through the first couple of games. So I know they're not necessarily playing like crazy competition, but it doesn't matter, right? Like we want to see the process in terms of what they can do. And it's not like these teams suck, right? Like, I mean, yeah, the Cavs are shorthanded, but like they still have some really good players out there, and the Celtics have some good players out there. So, all positives from the Knicks so far through the first couple of games.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, and it's really refreshing to see all their guys getting involved. Like you said, OG and Macau, right? Like those are guys that should be getting up a decent amount of shots as they would elsewhere if they weren't on the Knicks, right? So it is very cool to see Brunson kind of adapting and feeling this offense out because we already know how gifted he is. We already know that he's a very underrated playmaker as well. So it's very cool to not have to have as much pressure on him, but we already know that he and Towns can still perform in that elite two-man game, with the pick and roll, pick and pop. And I think that's what you kind of saw. Like there's sets where they really do, focus on that. But then there's other times where, those guys don't really need to touch the ball because you do have a OG on an Obi or a Mikal Bridges, who can, get, shot creating shots off. So it's nice to, have a pretty much a full starting five of, guys who can create their own shots.
Exactly, right? Just the balance, being able to have different options to turn to is what you want. And that's what we hope to continue to see from the Knicks as the season goes on, right? Because, you're going to need all those guys to contribute some way, shape, or form if you want to be able to contend, get out of the East, potentially win it all, right? Like all those guys at some point in a lot of these postseason series, right? Like they're gonna have to kind of showcase what they can do because a lot of those guys are very talented players, right? Like OG Anunoby is a talented player, Mikal Bridges talented player, so It's good to see, and they still have a little bit of flexibility in terms of the rotation because they're not going to play all those guys in the postseason, but just kind of the opportunity to see some guys that we didn't really get to see. And Malcolm Brogdon, he retired, so that opens the door for one of these other point guards, off the bench outside of Deuce McBride, who we know is going to play, to potentially kind of get their way into the rotation and see what type of value they could provide.
Yeah.
So a lot, like I said, pretty much all good from them.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, moving on, I guess, kind of moving around the league, just to kind of see some other, debuts, some new looks. We've seen the Orlando Magic, through a couple of games, right? They played the Miami Heat, won that game. They played the Atlanta Hawks, right, which is kind of a cool matchup because those are two teams that people are high on. Didn't win that game, but Desmond Bain, right, is the new guy, right? That's the guy that they've kind of introduced to this team, and you can already see right away the value that he's going to bring. Especially on the offensive end, where like this is a guy where he's a very versatile offensive player. We've talked about it. He's basically a guy who can give you 25 and 5 right on any given night with good 3-point shooting as well. And with the Magic on the offensive end, we've seen a very different style of offense where they've been a very slow paced offensive team where, so far through the first couple of games, they're playing at a much faster pace. And it's clearly an adjustment for a lot of these guys, especially like a Paolo, right? Because, in the first game, he played pretty well. I mean, I know it didn't look like he shot well, but I thought he played a relatively solid game, hit some big shots. Franz Wagner played well, too, right? Jalen Suggs, he played in his first game back since we hadn't seen him since his injuries. Looked pretty solid. But then in the second game, right, not a great game from Paolo, right? He shot 4 for 15.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's a process, right? Like I said, it's a completely different brand of offense, a lot of new pieces to work around. So, both you and I are very high on him. So it's a type of game where it's a bad game, right? And I think, like I said, it's a big adjustment for him to play a little bit of a different style where there's other guys that you can turn to on the offensive end. It's not going to have to just be, him and Franz doing anything and everything. So yeah, like it's just kind of a funny scenario. But Franz Wagner, right? That's the other thing is like he's actually been getting downhill. His jump shots fallen. I already talked about the value that Desmond Bain can add, and like that's part of the value. Is like now that's another guy that other teams have to guard, and so that's one extra body that you can't put on Franz Wagner or Paolo Banchero. So I think better days will continue to be ahead for this team. Anthony Black off the bench, he's been playing. We're not seeing Jace Richardson play at all, right? Just because he's just got drafted. So I think Tyus Jones, he's getting the backup point guard nod, right? Goga Batazde, he's playing as well. Isaac played in the first game, didn't play as much in the second game, so you do kind of wonder what type of rotation are they kind of figuring out. Tristan Da Silva, now he's kind of actually the main forward off the bench, right? That's getting the minutes. Even saw a little bit of Jet Howard too, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But for the Magic, like I said, against the Heat, I don't know. They won the game, but it's like I said, I think it's going to take a little bit of time for them to kind of figure some stuff out, just because it's not just that you're implementing a new face. Like I said, you're also implementing a little bit of a different offense as well. And I think the hope is you still have a lot of good defenders. So as they continue to get more reps, like I said, it's like some of these other teams, it'll continue to look more comfortable. Because like you're riding on Paolo also taking the leap as well. So obviously you're probably not going to win as many games where he shoots 4 for 15, but the fact that this was still a winnable game despite him shooting so poorly, and they actually were up for most of that game against Atlanta, that bodes well, right? Because he's not going to have, there are going to be games where your best player doesn't play as well, and you need to be able to win those games if you're going to be a contender. So I just think there's going to be some growing pains for them, but I think they'll be better for it.
Yeah, I think it's tough because like you said, you are integrating, a lot of newness, and I think those guys aren't really adjusted to it yet. And yeah, it hasn't been pretty. And I think people did expect it to be somewhat seamless, but once they do find that rhythm and a good balance of volume between all three of those guys, while also getting Suggs back into the mix, I think they'll be okay. I'm not really worried about them, But yeah, to be fair, it has not been pretty.
Yeah. So, um, yeah, we'll see how that team continues to progress. Guess we might as well mention Atlanta, right? They also, because they played against the Magic, right? But they actually played a game before that, right? Where they played the Raptors and it looked pretty bad, right? They couldn't really get stops. Trey Young didn't really have a great game. So no one really played amazing. I mean, like Jalen Johnson had his moments. I mean, they had stretches, but is just defensively, they could not get any stops against that Raptors team, which actually, honestly, through the first couple of games, we'll talk about them soon. They looked relatively solid. But, in the next game against the Magic, they looked better. Trey Young also had a much better game, so that's part of it as well. He hit the go-ahead shot. The classic Trey Young floater. A little bit of injury changes, right? Because Porzingis didn't play, had an illness. Hopefully, it's not the same illness that cost him a lot of time last season. And then Ricochet hurt his ankle, so they started Nikhil Alexander Walker, right? And through the first couple of games, right, he's kind of shown, flashes where he's been knocking down shots. Of course, he's been asked to do some work defensively, but this is another one of those teams where you are integrating some new pieces, and it's going to probably take some time. And if those guys are going to be out, I guess now you kind of just default to going back to Onyeka Okongwu, right? Is still good, but now we kind of get to see what it looks like with some of these guys, right? Like Dyson Daniels had a little bit of foul trouble in the first game. In the second game, he was able to stay on the floor, and when he's out there, that helps them defensively, right? Because I do think he's a guy where it's kind of hard to say, well, Dyson Daniels is off the floor. We got another guy who can do just as well. I mean, I guess that's kind of Nikhil Alexander Walker's role is a little bit different of a defender. So, I still like the mix of these guys. Just, defensively, that first game was not great, but like I said, I think it'll get better. Just because you have all the wings, you have all those switchable guys. I just do hope that, like I said, the Porzingis illness thing, it's maybe just we're not playing him in back to backs or extended stretches or whatever, because they need him to be really good. If you're gonna get the best version of this Hawks team, he can't just be there. He can't just exist. He
Right.
has to actually be able to produce on both ends of the floor, because he does provide value as a guy who can space the floor, a guy who can block shots, who can still be big and catch lobs and score in the post on mismatches, who can give Trey Young a popper, right? Which there's not been that many of those type of bigs for Atlanta. We talked about that's why, for such a low cost, it's a good deal. And then, like I said, we mentioned Jalen Johnson, where this is kind of his first action since he had that injury last year that cost him most of the second half of the season. So now he's going to be able to continue to get his feet wet and continue to get all these opportunities to progress, right? He got to the free throw line a ton against Toronto, and his progression is key as well, right? Because the better he is, the better Atlanta's going to be. So, like I said, growing pains, both for the Magic and the Hawks. But I think that there are some positives to take away, even though, there also been some nasty stretches as well.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think, the with the Raptors game, I felt like it was more of a that they got kind of caught off guard because I think
Right.
Toronto's kind of sneaky in terms of like, who they have offensively. Like that's a lot of firepower that you kind of have to deal with. And I think, Atlanta probably wasn't really prepared for that one. And like you said, it does not help that offensively they had, some awkward bungles, I think, especially from Trey Young himself. But in the second game, I think they did look a little bit better, and that's kind of what you want to see. You kind of want them to trend in a better direction.
Yeah. I guess, we were talking about the Raptors. What did you think of the Raptors through the first couple of games? Because obviously they blew out the Hawks in the first game, right? Basically won by 20, wasn't really that close. And then in the second game, right, they played the Bucks, and they played them to a draw, but then obviously Giannis took the game over, 30 points, 20 rebounds, even a couple of threes, right? So you might want to watch out if that's the case. But in the case of the Raptors, like you mentioned, a lot of offensive firepower, which is kind of one of the reasons why people were kind of wondering, what is this team? What is this team going to look like? How good could they actually be? Because you've seen Brandon Ingram leading the way, right? Showcasing his value as a scorer, as an offensive player. Scotty Barnes is out there kind of doing a little bit of everything. You got RJ Barrett, right, who's kind of settled into a role, right, where he's not necessarily having as many on the ball possessions, right? Like there's transition plays, there's spot ups, there's drives to the basket quickly. He's become a key piece for them as well. You got some guys off the bench, Mamu Kalashvili, right? Grady Dick. Jakob Poeltl obviously is starting as the center, you know, not quite as good as he was a few seasons ago, but this is kind of an intriguing team to me where both of us picked the over, where we're like, yeah, we could see a version of this where this could work. If Ingram is really good, and if guys can kind of make some sacrifices in terms of how they play. And so far through the first couple of games, I think you have seen it. It's just the 3-point shooting needs a little bit more work. Although in the second game, they shot 40%, 11 threes on 27 attempts. They got to the line a ton. And, aside from quickly, this is like a relatively big team. So I kind of like this team. Again, obviously it's tough going against Giannis, who is a one-man wrecking crew essentially. But what did you think of the Raptors so far through the first couple of games?
Yeah, that's the problem. I think, they really realistically should be 2-0, but they just happened to go up against the Milwaukee Bucks with Giannis, right? And that's the problem, right? They didn't really have necessarily an answer, for him. And, they weren't really able to stop him. The guy only missed 3 shots. So, super efficient game from him, and he's been on a tear as expected. But, yeah, defensively, I think that's where their woes are probably going to happen, right? Because we already know what
Mhm.
Brandon Ingram can do. We already know what RJ can do, right? Like, this is a solid collection of guys that I think have some versatility to them offensively, but there are too many questions defensively for me to be like, all right, like this is a really, really elite team. They're a good team, though. I will say that they are a good team, and I expect them to be good in this Eastern Conference.
Yeah. And then from the Bucks perspective, right? Terms of their team, Kevin Porter Jr. played in the first game. He did get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
So now they've kind of rolled out Ryan Rollins because we didn't know what the starting five was going to be. I think we had one kind of mapped out, and it's a little bit different, right? Because Ryan Rollins, AJ Green, Gary Trent Jr., Giannis, Miles Turner. Kuzma's coming off the bench now. Cole Anthony, right, is kind of the lead guard off the bench, right? Which I guess you kind of expected, but you didn't really know because you didn't know what the starting group was going to be. Because, like I said, Kevin Porter Jr. started. So it basically has been give Giannis the ball, let him work. He can kick out to shooters because we know he's a really good passer. I know what Şengün said, but Giannis is a very good passer. And they do have a lot of guys that are capable of knocking down threes, right? And you got Miles Turner as a shot blocker, as a guy who can roll or pop. And there is some versatility to this roster where it's like, yeah, there's guys out here who can contribute on both ends of the floor. It's a matter of it's still going to probably have to be a Giannis backpack. But you do have some guys like Cole Anthony at 23 points, 7 assists in this game. And he is a guy that from time to time can go off, right? We've seen him do that off the bench for Orlando at times. It's just a matter of, how many games, are you going to be able to get out of it? Because, you look at the Giannis stat line, and this was a close competitive game where it's like, Giannis having 30 and 20 in the game. Like you're almost thinking like, that's a certified win. But this was a really, like I said, back and forth game where the Bucks had to, do a lot in order to come back and win the game. And like I said, this was the argument that a lot of Bucks fans have made for why this team could be better than last year's team because you don't have Lillard, but you do have a lot more athletes. You do have more depth. You still have a lot of outside shooting. And there are a lot of people who feel like, yeah, this team can still win a lot of regular season games. And like I said, I know we took the under. I could see us definitely being wrong about that one. It's a matter of what can they do once they get to the postseason. And of course, stretched out over 82 games because, the nice thing is they are in the East, but what do you think about what you've seen from the Bucks the first couple of games?
I'm not buying it. I'm gonna be real. I mean, like, shout out to Giannis, and this is what I expected in terms of what he was gonna do on a nightly basis. And granted, like, look at who they played. Okay, Toronto, cool. Like I said, they don't necessarily have an answer defensively, for Giannis, right? And then you have the freaking Bucks or the Wizards, excuse me. The Bucks played the Wizards, and that was their first game, so I expected them to win. I want to see them go up against elite teams. That's the question mark, right? Like, what do they look like against a New York or something like that? Like, so how do they stack up in the East? Are they going to end up at the top or the bottom? And I think it's going to be probably middle or bottom. I just don't think this kind of play style is going to be sustainable, right? Where you do have Giannis backpacking every game, but can he do it for however many he plays? I don't know.
Yeah, and that's going to be the question. Is that's the argument for having a lot of depth during the regular season because it's like on any given night, yeah, Cole Anthony could have 20 points, Gary Trent Jr. could have 20 points. AJ Green, right, had 9 in this game, 3 of 5 from 3. Maybe he has like a 15, 18 point game. Kuzma, maybe he has a big game off the bench. So there are a lot of options to play through, and athletically, like, yeah, this is a more athletic team, than what they have. Like you said, it's just a matter of, can you stretch it out for 82 games? Because, there are going to be some Eastern Conference teams that are going to have, a different ability to win certain types of games. And it's all about matchups. But I am curious to continue to see more, right? Especially because Giannis, he knocked down a couple of threes in this game. And if he just all of a sudden is actually better from three, that could also be another thing where it's like, what are you going to do defensively against this guy? I'm curious to see if that holds up. But even then, they still have a bunch of other guys who can hit threes. I mean, it's not as, other than Giannis, pretty much everybody else who plays minutes for this team is capable of knocking down threes. What did you think of Miles Turner? Like, what do you think of that addition so far? Is it pretty much kind of, what you thought, or
I mean,
or some- or something else?
nasty
Because that's the big
offensively.
addition.
Yeah, nasty offensively. Not really a fan. Think he's been underperforming through, granted, 2 games offensively, right? It hasn't been pretty good. Like, what, he's shooting like 30% from the field, 7 points per game. So it's like, could be a lot better in that regard. But defensively, I mean, I think he's doing his job, right? He's not really getting bullied. But like I said, look at who they're playing. They're playing the Wizards and, Toronto, who don't really have a strong big man. So
hmm Yeah, so we'll see what happens. But that's as I said, that's a team to watch out for, just because with all the stuff surrounding Giannis, what do they look like this season? Because we don't know where the Bucks will end up after the season. Once we get into the playoffs. But like I said, just kind of a cool situation to watch, because he's going to put up big numbers. That's a guy where he's another guy like Luka that could be in the MVP race. Well, Giannis is always in the MVP race, but like, he might have a chance if the Bucks actually do a little bit better than maybe what is projected so far. So, um, moving on, I guess, because we hadn't talked about them yet, and they've only played 1 game. But they were part of that Warriors Nuggets night, but they were part of that Warriors nightcap, and it was the Nuggets, right? Because we talked about the Warriors, but we also did kind of get to see Denver in this game. And actually, in the game, they had the edge for most of it. They trailed early, then they took the lead back and had the lead for most of the game. Warriors took the lead late in the third, and then the Nuggets, with their bench, were actually able to get back into the game and take the lead and held it. And then they couldn't close it out, right? Jokic really had an awful game, in my opinion, on both ends of the floor. And then, Steph, of course, hits the big shot. They go into overtime. He basically takes the game over and closes it out. But Aaron Gordon had 50. So, as I mentioned, Jokic was awful, but Aaron Gordon, for a decent chunk of the game, was the best player on the floor. 50 points, 10 of 11 from three, 17 of 21 from the field. Absurd. But he's continued to showcase, like, this 3-point shooting that he's unlocked is real, right? Like, now he's not going to shoot 90% from three every game, but just the fact that now he's a guy that you have to guard. I mean, there were a few times where, like, they actually still left him open and kind of dared him to take shots. And it's like, there's no way he's going to keep making them. And he was. But you just kind of look around. This is supposed to be kind of this is another team that made some changes, right? The thing with them was, as the game went on, it almost just kind of felt like some of these guys just ran out of gas, right? Like, and I know Dave Adamman talked about, yeah, everybody's in good shape. I don't know if that was the case from what I saw, because at least in terms of what I saw from Jokic, he didn't look like he was in necessarily the best of shape compared to what we've seen, in the last couple of seasons, right? He looked a little bit bigger. And I know that was the case in Eurobasket as well. And it's not like he's ever necessarily looked, like a Greek god or anything, but
right,
it
right.
just and maybe it was just a weird game where he's just, I don't know, just trying to get other guys involved. But it just was kind of an ugly game from him, where, 13 3-point attempts, that's way too many for him. And I know obviously he can shoot threes, but there were a lot of possessions where it just felt like he settled, against a team where, like, yeah, they have some more bigs, but they didn't even play Quentin Post other than like 4 minutes. So for most of the game, you don't really have anybody size wise who can match up. I mean, Horford's a big dude, but Jokic is even bigger than that. And the combination of him and Christian Brown defensively was a real problem, where, like, Brown can't really get around the screens. So Steph is able to just do whatever he wants. And he's a tough matchup anyway. So it's not like he's, a guy that you can just easily guard. But just as a whole, it was rough for those guys on the defensive end, especially in the second half. Offensively, I think it was mostly positives. Like I said, aside from Jokic, I mean, again, the 3-point shooting, most of that came from Aaron Gordon.
Yeah.
But just some of these guys just kind of ran out of gas. When you look at the bench, Tim Hardaway Jr. came in, played his role of knocking down shots. Bruce Brown had some good moments, rebounding, secondary playmaking, tough, gritty defense. Didn't see a whole lot of Peyton Watson. Didn't really do a whole lot in this game. Valanciunas came in, actually played relatively well, at least on the offensive end. Just, a guy that you can put in for 10, 15 minutes so that way Jokic isn't playing 48. I mean, he played 40, but that's because he played overtime as well. So, in terms of the bench, I mean, and the bench, if you look at the plus minuses on everything, but those were the guys that actually got them back into the game. The starters, other than the first half, the second half, they didn't really play all that well, other than Aaron Gordon and Cam Johnson had a very quiet game, minus 17 in the minutes he played. Didn't really knock down shots, looked fine defensively, but, just offensively, I thought was kind of underwhelming, looked very hesitant as well. Kind of had some rough offensive possessions. Again, it's his first regular season game, but I have not been quite as impressed with him on the offensive end in the games that I've seen from him, even going back to preseason. And it just feels like hopefully he can kind of continue to get some more time and continue to be more confident. But they need him to be good because you traded Michael Porter Jr. for him. And obviously it's not just that, but like you're also acquiring more depth. But the depth doesn't matter as much if the starting five is worse.
Yeah.
And, for Cam Johnson, I'm not saying he's going to play like this all the time. He'll play better, in my opinion. But it just feels like there's a level of, comfort where it's just not quite there, because like even Tim Hardaway Jr., I mean, he looked pretty much like the same guy to me, right, from what I've seen from him for the last few years. So can you get that from Cam Johnson offensively? Other than that, like I said, Aaron Gordon was awesome. Him, like I said, being a 3-point shooter changes so much for what they can do on offense. But obviously it starts with Jokic because he was not good in this game, in my opinion. And he's going to have to be better, especially against this team where, just matchup wise, he should be the best player on the floor more often than not. Obviously, Steph is going to do whatever he wants for the most part because they don't have a KCP defender to chase him around screens. So he may just be better now. In the first half, I thought they did well with him defensively. But just as a whole, like I said, on the offensive end, there were a lot of positives, and I think it can still be better. But I do think the defense is going to need a little bit more work, and I think it can be better. And if those guys, get in a little bit better shape, because like I said, that's what it looked like to me. Maybe it didn't look like it to you. Like I said, this is the team that I did pick to win the championship, and the first half looked good. Second half, overtime, not quite so much.
Yeah, it was a wild game. I mean, like, first of all, shout out to Aaron Gordon for dropping a freaking 50 bomb. That was unexpected, completely unexpected. 10 for 11 from the 3-point line. It's crazy. But like you said, it does start with Jokic, right? And I know it's crazy to say that, a triple-double, is a bad game from him. But, yeah, realistically, it was bad. Like you said, too many 3-point attempts, not enough, I think taking advantage of mismatches and not enough smart plays from him. What's up?
Even the finishes where he makes like 9 out of, where he shoots, he's like 9 out of 10 times those go in. Like they
didn't go in. Yeah, exactly. It was just an off night for him, I guess. Jamal Murray, I think he played well, but defensively is definitely where they got freaking fried, right? Like Steph, had 42, and I think, a Steph 42 with, whatever else the Warriors were able to bring, right? Like Jimmy Butler, perfect compliment. Kuminga as well, like, and the guys off the bench too. Like, it was just a little bit, I think, overwhelming for, Denver, especially down the line, like you said. And, Steph having, pretty much just dazzling in the overtime period. It is what it is. They just really couldn't keep up. And, I think they'll be okay, but there are some glaring issues that need to be ironed out, I think, before, their next game.
Yeah. I guess, might be jumping the gun here, but like, this could be a potential playoff matchup where like these two teams could see each other in the playoffs depending on how the seeding goes. And, like, what do you think of this matchup now? Like based off of, what we've seen from the Warriors in terms of the added depth, even with a guy like Horford.
Yeah. I mean, I think if they can play like that every night, like it was a close game. It went to overtime, right? And Golden State won by 7 or 6, but I think they have what it takes to probably take this team in a 7-game series. It really just depends on Jokic, though, right? Because I don't expect Jokic to play like that every night. Right. I expect him to be much, much better. So there is that, and I don't know. It is interesting, but
They're
then
not getting
you'd have to get
from
the
Aaron
best
Gordon.
version of Jimmy Butler, Steph as well. But yeah, like is Aaron
Yeah,
Gordon gonna pop off for 50? Probably not.
right. I mean, he does play very well against this team, and that's kind of like if Jokic is this bad, like over 7 games, like yeah, the like that's how you're gonna lose. Like if Steph is the best player in the series, you're getting crushed probably. Like
Yeah,
that may not even go 7 if he's like if it's that stark in terms of the difference. But like you said, you expect Jokic to be better. And it's just it is what it is. But and it's funny, right? Because we say all that, but Denver was up for most of this game and then could not close it out. And like for Denver, we know like oftentimes in close games they've tended to be very good. But you got to be able to get stops, and they Steph he missed the layup, they got the stop, and then Jokic they couldn't score, and then boom, what happened? Steph comes right back down and hits a much tougher shot, and then like I said, it goes into OT. Denver doesn't score, so they're either way. Their identity is offense, anyways. If you're Denver, but just as a whole, it. It's game one,
yeah,
so like it's obviously they can be a lot better, but yeah, Jokic is gonna have to be better. And
way better.
what did you think he looked body wise different from what you've seen, or is it just kind of like just like a placebo? Maybe he was just sluggish or tired, or had a bad night's sleep or whatever. Because it felt different to me, and even other people that I talked to, they felt like that they saw a difference in terms of just what they normally see. And like I said, he's never been like an overly muscular guy, but it looked different from what I had seen personally.
I mean, he looked like he was kind of moving in molasses a little bit here and there, and then also kind of I don't want to say felt, but looked a little heavy set, and he's already heavy set to begin with. So it didn't. I don't know. I think
Yeah,
there was a noticeable difference in terms of potential
yeah.
conditioning.
Yeah, and even on defense, right? Like, because he normally plays pretty high up, right, on those Steph screens, and like he just,
He just dropped. It was so weird.
yeah, he just dropped, and it was just weird. It was a weird game from him. I don't know really what that was, but yeah, obviously, yeah, they're not going to be able to win if he plays at that level.
Right.
But like you said, like yeah, like a triple double normally isn't a bad game, but that was not a good game in my opinion. But
Yeah.
um, moving on. Uh, what team do you want to talk about next? Do you have a team that you kind of want to highlight, or uh, what are you kind of thinking? Because there's still a lot of teams to talk about. Because like I said, we're in the first week or whatever, and there's so many good things that we've kind of seen from a lot of teams. But is there kind of a team you might want to highlight?
Um. I mean, I think you kind of have to shout out Memphis for sure.
Mm,
Um.
Okay,
Yeah, them being 1-1, I think already kind of makes me feel a little bit better about them. Considering the injuries and stuff. What did
even
you?
with the 40-point trip.
I know, but like, what did you think of them?
Well, I thought like in the first game against the Grizzlies, or excuse me, against the Pelicans,
Mm-hmm.
my bad, right? Because that was a back and forth game, right? When like, shout out to Zion. Um, but it just seemed, but yeah, the job was spectacular, right? In that first game. And like that version of Ja, that's a version where like if you can get him, then yeah, your floor is going to be a lot higher as long as he's out there and he's healthy. The second game, right, he came into that game seemed like with an ankle thing going on, and he did not have a good game. He was what 4 for 16. I mean, really nobody played well for the Grizz. I mean, if you lose by like 30, 40 points, I mean, especially like you gave up what it was like 80 something points to the Heat at halftime, which is a team that I don't think anybody right now is on. Now they changed their starting five, but just as a whole, it's just when you lose by that much, you almost kind of wonder like, is it just a bad night, right? Because like that first game, they looked better against the Pelicans, and Ja was so good in that game. And like I said, hope the thing that's so tough is the other guards are out. Like you don't have Scottie Pippen Jr. Ty Jerome gets hurt in the preseason, and now he's out for at least a month with the calf injury. So you don't have anybody to turn to off the bench to be like a reliable guard,
Yeah.
right? Like, Cedric Howard came off the bench, and I think him being good right out of the gates, like that's a good sign. So there's a lot to like there. KCP looks better than he did in Orlando, and which I guess the argument that people kind of made was look at Orlando's offense, the way they play compared to a team like Memphis, where he's just going to be in a better spot offensively, right? Like he was probably tasked to do a little bit too much on the offensive end in Orlando, given what he can realistically do as a player. So I like that. It's just a matter of these guys got to come back healthy. Like, if at some point you can get Edie, get Brandon Clark, get your other guards back, that will help them. But those guys are still kind of a ways away. But for now, it's going to have to just be John Morant, just probably being somewhere close to the best player on the floor every night. And, we've seen him be able to do that. It's just, can he do it for a prolonged stretch? Because we know he's had some trouble staying healthy. And, if they're just going to have all these injuries, it's going to be a nightmarish season for them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the tough part where they need to get these guys back. It just sucks to have all those guys out already.
Yeah. But at least they're not 0-2. I thought they were going to start off without any wins.
Yeah. I guess we might as well talk about a team that is 0-2. We can mention the New York Pelicans, or excuse me, the New Orleans Pelicans.
Yeah,
New Orleans Pelicans. Zion, right? I think we've seen some good play from him in terms of getting downhill, being active as a player. Jordan Poole's been starting, but they cannot defend. I mean, it's really abysmal in my opinion. And it's like, yeah, okay, they do have some of their bigs out, like no Kevon Looney. I think that would have been the starting center had he not gotten injured. Yves Missi started in his place, then he gets injured, right? So now you're kind of really bare bones in terms of your, center rotation. And, without, some type of helpful physical, type of big option, it's just tough. I mean, like you have Herb Jones, he's a good defender. But after that, there's not a lot of guys in that rotation where I'm like, yeah, that's, like a positive every night, defensive guy. Like I said, I mentioned Herb Jones. Murphy's okay on the defensive end, but I wouldn't necessarily call him like a great or elite defender. And it's just rough because they have a number of individual players that I like, right? And it's like, if you're talking about, while DeJounte Murray's out, it's like, okay, Poole, as like a change of pace, I guess, offensive guard. Like, that's cool and all, but just they got to find ways to get stops because they were in both of those games. And they could have won both of those games, but they just, like I said, even in the Spurs game, right? Wemby fouls out, and it's like, wow, okay, well, their best player, their rim protector, their best offensive player is out, and then they still can't get stops, right? Because other guys kind of take turns scoring. So that's rough, and that's a team where they gave up their first this year, so they need to win games. But like I said, without those bigs, it's going to be tough because they're going to kind of be forced into maybe running some smaller lineups, which could give Zion some more spacing, so you can see good stretches from him. But it's rough. But I will say at least one positive I will give is Jeremiah Fears through the first couple of games has looked really good, and that's a positive sign, right? Because he was going to have to get minutes and an opportunity with some of these guys out. So I'm at least happy from that perspective where he looks like he's going to be, really good,
Yeah.
which was kind of what we thought. It was just like, because we're both high on him. It was just, what was he going to look like with this team, with this group of guys? But he being forced into kind of playing a lot more. He's looked solid. He's looked comfortable.
Yep.
Which is a good thing, right? Because he looked kind of, I don't know, out of it
Horrible
in the summer league,
preseason.
and in the preseason. It looked kind of rough, but through the first couple of games, at least having some type of presence at the point guard spot, to give you a little bit of a different look from Poole, that's good. But other than that, it's tough. And I'd like to see Derek Queen play, but he's not really played, at all. I mean, I guess he just came back from his injury. So maybe he's going to be eased into it, but that's the guy they drafted. So, you don't have any other bigs right now. So they just signed DeAndre Jordan. That's how rough it's got.
Yeah. Pelicans. I mean, but we kind of expected this, right? Like, I don't think we picked the over for this team at all. So, I mean, kind of somewhat expected. Zion, I think, looks solid, right? But definitely could be a little bit better. I think I do like Poole being in the starting lineup. And like you said, Fears looks solid as well. It's just, where's the defense at, man? There is none. Hey, but at least Derek Queen played.
So what did you think of Derek Queen in the minutes he played?
Yeah, I mean, played 35 minutes, 50%, well, actually a little bit above 50%, from the field. But, defensively is the problem, right? Because that's another big, but he fouled out. So that's where it's like, okay, yeah, tough cover in Wemby, but offensively, I think he's going to be as advertised, right? Back to the basket big, old school post scoring, cool. But, yeah, defensively, I think there might be some issues. He did have 2 blocks though, so I do give him credit in terms of that. But it would be
Right.
nice to kind of see him in the starting lineup, but maybe he just wasn't prepared for that yet.
Yeah, and that's kind of the big thing here where, I did mention fears, but also like with Queen, where it's like, yeah, these guys, have an opportunity to play with some of these injuries out. So we'll get to see them earlier than we expected. But it's just a matter of, you are going to have to be relying on these guys to help get you some wins. And they're rookies. So there's going to be, like I said, growing pains for both of those guys. And I am kind of curious to see what it looks like as the year goes on. Like they started Sadiq Bey as the center, basically. I mean, I guess unless you want to call Zion the center, but like,
Pretty
it's
much,
just
yeah.
like, yeah, like when you have to do that, and like in fairness, like Sadiq Bey's been a solid addition, I guess, for the Pelicans. He's just not a center. So I mean, it's kind of hard to do, in my opinion. Especially like playing small, but not having like a lot of great defensive players. I mean, that starting five: Jordan Poole, Zion, Murphy's okay. Bay's okay, but like I mean, Herb Jones is like your only like high level elite defender in that group, and I guess maybe you can call him the center defensively, sort of, but he couldn't knock down any shots, and part of his value in terms of him getting paid is like he's an elite defender, but like he became a really good 3-point shooter. Last year he didn't shoot well, but he was also hurt, so he's gonna have to be better as well, but he'd be the least of their concerns. Like
Right.
just because again, he can help out at least on the defensive end, and you have other offensive guys. It's not like you're expecting Herb Jones to be a big time scorer for you, but it's tricky. But I would at least like to see one of the like to see Looney back as a veteran big. I guess he'll be out for a while. So maybe it'll be DeAndre Jordan, but it's like I can't really expect him to start or play a whole lot because he's not done that in quite some time. So
Yeah, I'm worried about the Pelicans, but we foresaw this.
yeah. So I guess also moving around, Indiana Pacers. We got to see them as well. They played against Oklahoma City. Unfortunately, Andrew Nemhard's hurt now, so hopefully he's not out for a long time. But they're without Halliburton. They're without McConnell. But I think at least on the offensive end, like there's still a lot of guys that can contribute on that end of the floor. Like Siakam, you got Jarvis Walker coming off the bench playing now, but that center spot, it is rough, which is kind of, I think, what we assumed going into the season. But it's like Isaiah Jackson, but unfortunately, he's a guy that gets into foul trouble a lot, which
Mhm.
is kind of like you said, what we expected, right? Because we've seen him play before, and he is a guy that can contribute. He's athletic, he's active, but he fouls a lot. Jay Huff can space the floor, but again, he's not a guy that you can stretch out to like 25, plus minutes. So I guess, yeah, you can get minutes from him, from Jay Huff and Tony Bradley, and then I guess Obi Toppin and Siakam can play extended minutes. But just I do like a lot of the guys on this team, and there is something to be said about the fact that like they went to the final, so they've gotten playing experience. Benedict Mathurin, right, has kind of been forced into a higher usage role. And we'll see if he can keep it up. He had 36 and 11 rebounds, that is, against Oklahoma City. But this is a team where, like I said, I think it's going to be tough, and they already have a couple injuries. And if Nemhard is hurt and he's going to be out for an extended period of time, that was my pick for most improved. Probably should have been Mathurin, but that might be game over relatively soon.
Yeah, I mean, they look pretty good, I thought, against OKC, but there's just you can't really replace what Halliburton brings to the team. It was a dogfight, and granted, Oklahoma City coming off of, or well, going into a back-to-back, so they were coming off of one game, and we already know how that thriller was. But yeah, I think there are some glaring issues with that team, and it starts at the center position, and it's gonna be a rough season for them, I think.
Yeah. Want to also mention the Philadelphia 76ers, right? We didn't see a lot from Embiid because he was on a minutes restriction, didn't play well. But VJ Edgecombe
Oh
with
boy.
Tyrese Maxey, right? Yep, that's the guy where I obviously people's minds changed on the Edgecombe pick, but like just as a whole, he showed flashes of why everybody was really high on him because of the fact that he's a great athlete. Off the catch, he's very comfortable attacking, knocking down the jump shot as well. It's kind of funny because in watching him play, especially with the frame, he doesn't even look like a rookie. Obviously, I mean, he is a rookie, but he just looks so comfortable out there, and just with him and Maxey together, that's a lot of balance in that backcourt. To where they were able. I mean, yeah, they played the Celtics, and that's a team where I think they're probably not going to be as good, but just as a whole, that's kind of one of the benefits where like now you have a guy where, yeah, let's say Embiid's out or he's on a minutes restriction. He can give you some more punch now, like some realistic punch. I know Quentin Grimes kind of did that. A lot of that was when the season was over, right? That's probably not his actual role as a player. But in terms of Edgecombe, he can do that and then some as an athlete, where he, like the Celtics had really no real answer, for him, or Maxi for that matter, right? And that backcourt together, eventually Jared McCain will be back. I mean, that's a lot of talent in that guard spot where, like I said, if Embiid can't get quite as much out of him, they should still be able to win some games. And, even Paul George has been out. So that makes me feel a little bit better about Philly. You still need a healthy Embiid. But but Edgecombe has been fantastic. And like, that's a bonus. That, I mean, that was like just lottery luck in the truest sense of the word.
Yeah, the fact that VJ Edgecombe is on Philly makes a big difference, right? Like the guy had an explosive debut, and you're right. Like he and Maxi complement each other so well because we know Maxi's more about speed and finesse, but Edgecombe is more about power and athleticism, and that's the great part about it. And he showed that he can shoot potentially. At least flashes of it, right? Like, is 50% from the three ball, going to be sustainable? Probably not. But I think it at least shows you that there's flashes and that it's there. And yeah, they're explosive, right? Combining for 74 points in total against, granted, Boston, but look at the way that Philly's structured right now. Like Embiid didn't play too well, and Paul George didn't play as well. So I think very, very good things from Philly.
Yeah. Couple of teams that we'll kind of look at before we kind of wrap it up, so that way we don't go through every single team, but I'll mention just a couple. Of Minnesota, it's another one just to highlight. I mentioned them against the Lakers, but one of kind of the key things here is they did do a switch up in their lineup, right? Because now Dante DiVincenzo is going to be the starting point guard, from here on out, right? Mike Conley's in a backup role. And it's funny, right? Because they played the Blazers, right? Uh, in their first game, and it was kind of rough, right? Where obviously Edwards was able to save them by the end of the game, but Portland had the edge for most of the game, and honestly, Portland's looked pretty solid through the first couple of games. We'll probably touch more on them in the next episode, but just in terms of Minnesota, like in terms of Ant getting to the mid range, knocking down the mid range more, he's been very effective at that. That's something he worked on offensively in the summer, right? Because we know he can comfortably knock down threes, but the in between game is kind of what you're looking at, right? Randall's still, settling comfortably into his role, right? McDaniels still fouls a lot, right? So that's kind of an annoying aspect of his game. But that point guard spot is something to watch, right? Because like DiVincenzo, he's not really a point guard, right? Like, he's more of an off guard, like a 3-and-D type of guy. Yeah, he can handle the ball, bring the ball up, and run some sets. But it just kind of feels like now that Conley's in a backup role, it's different, and he's not looked very good through the first couple of games, which I guess we probably should have seen it coming. I think we did kind of see it coming, but there's a name that we hadn't mentioned, Mr. Rob Dillingham. He's not really played at all in the first two games. He's not really been part of the rotation. In the Laker game, he played what, like 1 minute
or
in
less.
The fourth quarter. Yeah, less than before he unfortunately got hurt.
Yeah.
But that game was kind of already like getting away from them, right?
Yeah.
Like it wasn't like it was a 2-point game going into the fourth quarter. Let's put him in and give us some offensive punch. Like it basically was like, get in here, it's garbage time almost. I mean, I know it wasn't, but like it wasn't looking good for Minnesota by that point. So that's kind of something I didn't really expect, because we talked about it going into the season where you need this guy to be a consistent rotational piece for you, especially to help you out on the offensive end, just as a shot creator, as a playmaker, just a guy that can help bring up the ball and score, so that way it's not just Ant and then Randall. But he just has not been a fixture at all in the rotation. And is it just he's just not good?
No,
that's
he's
kind
good.
of
I think he's good.
I'm just asking because that's kind of a problem where, like, in year because like they have other young guys on the roster, and they've talked about like integrating these young pieces onto the team. to kind of stabilize and to replace some of the guys that they lost. Like they lost Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Like Terrence Shannon Jr. is playing. Jalen Clark is playing. I don't see Rob Dillingham out there. So that's kind of a question that I have where, like, what's going on there? Because if he's just year two, still, I mean, Bones Highland, who was kind of like out of the league, right? Like, it wasn't like he was, like I know he had played, on some of those other teams, but like, that's like a backup point guard, like essentially, right? Third string point guard at this point. He's getting minutes over Rob Dillingham, and it's not like he's been bad at all. It's just I just kind of wonder what's going on there because it just feels like if he's, in year two and still not really playing or being part of the rotation, that's bad because that's a guy that I mean, I know they didn't give up, their entire future, but they did give up some picks to bring him in. And I just think that you kind of expect if you're going to do that, that he's going to play. And, like right now, like they're settled into the rotation. And like I said, he's not played through the first two games. Hopefully he's not injured to the point where he's out for a long stretch, but that's a storyline to kind of look at just because, like I kind of factored him in as a part of this team going into the season in terms of his progression, helping them out. But he's not been there. And like I said, I'm just like, is he just not good? Like, do they not think he's good at all? Because, it's not, they're playing those other guys, they're playing the other young guys, and they're getting minutes and he's not. So I don't know what to tell you. And I guess like role wise, if Conley's the backup point guard, I guess it'd be kind of hard to have him and Dillingham out there together. It just makes me just kind of wonder, like, okay, maybe then that's what'll happen. Maybe Conley just gets eased out. Like if he just plays badly from here on out, maybe he'll just get replaced with Dillingham. But I don't know because, like, they are kind of different point guards, him and Conley. So there is a value that Conley brings to the team from a playmaking standpoint and just kind of reorganizing everything. That's not necessarily Dillingham's game, but I'm kind of surprised that he's not playing at all. Like I can understand him not starting, but just being a flat out like basically you're not playing unless it's like a blowout. Like that I don't know. It's kind of weird to me.
Yeah, I agree. It's the 8th pick in the draft from last year. So it's like, what are we doing? I feel like this guy should be at least getting an opportunity. But hey, who knows? We don't really know all the things going on behind the scenes. But scheme wise, I think it is kind of hard to fit him in there, especially considering that Ant is so ball dominant, right? Mm-hmm. So like, and you don't want him to be the commander of the second unit. I think that's a little bit too much pressure, right? Because I feel like he could be more of a microwave. But in my opinion, my expectation for him was kind of to take over the starting point guard mantle borderline by the end of this season, if not going into the next one. So it's like the fact that he's not playing and has logged literally less than a minute and a personal foul in 2 games as the 8th pick in the draft last year is scary. So I don't know. Right. I don't know.
And he played in preseason, right? It's not like
good.
Yeah, so I don't know. It's kind of odd. And I guess like, last but not least, the Clippers. Tale of 2 games. So I don't even know what to really say because the first game they play the Jazz, they lose by 40. It's not close at all. Second game they play the Suns, they trail early, and then they close it out, and then they blow the brakes off of Phoenix in the second game. It's weird because the bench has been really good, right? Like or some of the guys, right? Like Collins has come off the bench, which is surprising to me. I kind of assumed he would start. Instead, it's Derek Jones Jr. Lopez, pretty solid through the first couple of games. But it's weird, right? Because, I don't know what to say. Because like I said, through the first couple of games, it's so stark. It's so different where you get blown out in one game, then it's a blowout in the second game. And, again, there are new pieces to factor in. But like I said, the main thing is I was kind of surprised in terms of the starting 5. Because I just assumed that Collins was just going to be penciled in as the starter, and he's the backup. And it's I guess one of the arguments for not starting him and starting someone else, I guess, is defensively. Who the heck is your main guy defensively in the lineup? But if that's the case, why not just go with Chris Dunn? I guess just because that was the guy that they had last year. But it is. I'm kind of curious to see what it looks like because you could just make the case that like it's almost kind of like, say, the Jazz game is like the worst case scenario for the Clippers, where it's like they look old, they look unathletic, they look kind of slow, not a lot of defense. And then in the second game, it's a much better process where like that's kind of the good version of the team. So somewhere in the middle, maybe.
Maybe.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think it'll even out. I think I agree with you. Somewhere in the middle probably is where they're going to land. And I think I need to see more of the team, right? We probably need to see, just more. What does Beal look like by the end of the season? And is the starting lineup going to continue to change? Do they kind of revert back to their identity last year, which I think a lot of people were high on? But this year, they have a lot more offensive firepower and definitely a lot more depth. And in the second game, like you said, they definitely did look better. And, shout out to them. So.
Yeah. But yeah, so we'll see. But so far it's been, great. And then also the Amazon Prime broadcast, they made their debut on Friday, right? With the two primetime games, right? Celtics, Knicks, Lakers, Wolves. They did a really good job. Their setup was very different than NBC, right? Because like they're in the studio, in this giant studio that's in, I think, Culver City in California or whatever. They have this giant court. They have the court in the studio where they're like, you can see Nash, you can see Haslam and Blake Griffin, and Taylor Rooks, and Dirk Nowitzki. They're like breaking down, the plays of the game. Like in the Knicks Celtics game, Haslam, he broke down the Knicks defense. And then after the Lakers Wolves game, right, like Nash, he's kind of explaining the screen setting and the rolling that we saw like from the Lakers and DeAndre Ayton. So it's a really good job. It's a really good product. They all of them bring something different to the table. And it's funny, right? Because like we saw Aslam on ESPN in the past.
Mhm.
It's kind of different, right? Like it's not really, it's very different in terms of the stuff he was doing, in terms of the how he was covering it. And like I said, they all did a really good job, on the game, in terms of the calls, right? You had the broadcasters as well. Good to see Kevin Harlan back, but just really good broadcast, I think, from them.
Yeah, I thought it was solid, right? Like they showed off a lot of the nuances, right? They showed off the Amazon money too. So yeah, like the LED court, I think was the biggest takeaway for sure. And I think they all had good chemistry. They all had good things to say. So yeah, it's gonna be fun.
Yeah. So I guess we'll get into some, now the news segment
boy.
to close it out. This was kind of the thing that it kind of took away from the NBA on the opening week. And if you've probably already heard it by now, but obviously you got Chauncey Billups, Terry Rozier, Damon Jones arrested, right, for allegedly, right, being involved in some gambling mishaps, let's just say, right? In the case of, right, Rozier, right, his was kind of dating back to 2023, right, where it's like, the over under stuff where he's like faking an injury or whatever, and then comes out of the game, and he was kind of telling people before the game, about, take the under on my stats or whatever. And you can't really do that, of course, as we already know. You can get in big trouble for that. And then in the case of Billups, right, his was kind of twofold, right? Because his one was, he was part of the gambling thing, just different sect, because he allegedly, right, was informing people about, hey, our team, is we're gonna start tanking, we're gonna stink, so you better start taking the unders on us if you want, if you want to get ahead or whatever, right? And then the other part, right, that was the surprise, was the poker stuff, right? Allegedly, right, where like there's the mafia involved. They have like X-rays. They have tinted glasses or whatever it was. Just a lot of high tech gear, for a poker game, and obviously you can't do that either. So just not great, and not a good look, I would say. And then Damon Jones, right? Obviously, he also had some ties, right? Because he knew beforehand, right, that LeBron was not going to play in the game against the Bucks. I think this was 2023, right? I think it was tied to the foot injury. So then he was telling people about stuff. Can't do that as well. Allegedly, this is all alleged. There's indictments if you want to read it in more detail. We're not lawyers, but just not a good look for really anybody involved, right? Obviously, not a great look for those guys, because worst case scenario, they could face some time. Best case scenario, they probably don't touch the NBA again. Right? I think for the Blazers, they've already named Thiago Splitter as the interim head coach. Former Spur, right, champion, right? Of course, we all remember him.
Uh-huh.
And Rozier, I don't know what they're gonna do with that, right? He's in the last year of his deal. So I don't know what's gonna happen there. But like I said, not a great look for them, and not even really honestly a great look for the NBA either, right? Because if you remember, right, the NBA did its own investigation into the Rozier thing and they didn't find anything, right? And then apparently the FBI was actually able to find some stuff, and was like, yeah, just watch this. So, then they were on, television kind of broadcasting everything. So just bad, honestly. And, this is kind of, I guess, kind of the worst case scenario in terms of the gambling stuff. Obviously, if you remember, you might remember the Tim Donaghy thing with the refs. That wasn't great either, right? That was a big scandal long time ago, I guess, at this point. But yeah, it just sucks, right? Especially because, in the case of Billups, I know he's a guy that was highly respected around the league. Most people have said nothing but positive things about him, right? And he was coaching the Blazers, right? They were getting better, and now his career might be over. And then obviously in the case of Rozier, right? He was once really good. I don't know what happened once he joined Miami. Maybe it was that. I don't know. But just as a whole, it just stinks. Just because this, we're talking about it now later, but when this happened, this kind of took the wind out of the sails for the NBA because you had all these great games, all these great performances, and this was kind of center stage, where it's just like I said, not a good look for really anyone.
Yeah, I don't even really know what to say. It's kind of like you said, it's all alleged, but damn near pretty much confirmed, right? And it's like it's insulting to the game, in my opinion, right? You're insulting the integrity of it, right? Especially as players, and now you have coaches as well involved, and it's disrespectful in my opinion. But I'm glad that it's been unearthed. I think it's better that it's out there now. It does suck that it happened during opening week because it would have been nice to have ended on a high note, with all the great performances and great games and entertainment that we were able to see. But instead, we have to talk about this. But there will be more developments. I know all these guys have to appear in court, so this won't be the last time we're talking about this stuff, right? Like we're gonna probably end up talking about it through December, if not later than that. But yeah, Shams dropped the bomb. Everybody's like, "Holy crap! Like, what the heck is going on?" And yeah, it is wild because some of this stuff was kind of resolved, thought to be right, like the Rozier thing. But then I think the biggest bombshell for me was definitely Billups because we're talking about some serious mafia people involved in this, and not a good look, I think, for for the league.
Yeah. If you check out the indictment, yeah, just look at the names associated in terms of like the mafia people involved. It's something. So just yeah, not great. And the thing is for the people who bet, right? Like obviously that's bad because there are people who might bet and then basically get frauded, right? In terms of with that type of stuff. So you have to protect the consumer as well. So just yeah, like I said, it's just a real bummer, and we'll see what happens. And like I said, for the NBA, like what's going on? Because just you did an investigation already, and this is not the only investigation, right? Because remember, I think it was the Jackson Hayes thing, right, where they did the investigation with that. You had the video, and just they didn't find anything. And like I said, I'm not saying anything uh too negative, but just as a whole, it just like the NBA kind of needs to be better, in this case, just because, like you basically have all that basically says like, yeah, you guys didn't really do a good job. And who knows? I don't know if does that put more pressure on them to do something with the Clippers tree planting business? I don't know. So, we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah, but after that, pretty much, yeah, that pretty much concludes the episode of Off Ball Takes. Obviously, as we normally do, right? We can always look at, the polls and the interaction that we have, from our followers. And this was tied. This was way back. This was tied to the Durant extension, right? Because that was the last thing that we did. And the question was, good deal for Durant and the Rockets, and 100% said yes, right? He took less money to stay with the Rockets for the next couple of seasons. And that one was a no-brainer, for both sides. Because I don't think the Rockets would have given him the full max anyways.
Yeah.
But for Durant, you get your guaranteed money. It is less, so you did have to sacrifice some, but it helps keep the team together.
Yeah, it's like and it's pennies to these guys at this point. So I think he would more than be willing to do that. So
Yeah. Well, that concludes today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Great week of NBA hoops. Hopefully, we'll get some great more weeks of NBA hoops. And of course, if you want to get involved, follow us at the OBT Podcast on any of our socials. You can look at our polls, leave comments, and continue to like and subscribe. Continue to help the channel grow. We appreciate all the support. We'll see you next time.